Perfect.
Okay, so we got most of these parts came with the 2 separate MIDI startup kits we got, but we ended up ordering these buttons and these potentiometers off Amazon. There were some COVID holdups on some of this, but luckily one of us had Prime, so we were able to get it faster.
All right, so after we gathered the materials for our MIDI controller, we sketched and started working with templates here all together. And ultimately for the buttons, the wiring diagram, we followed this schematic. And for the LCD diagram, wiring diagram, we used this one. So we merged a whole bunch of different wiring diagrams together. This one's for the toggle switch. And once we created the connections that we needed, we downloaded the software. So the Arduino IDE software was our main home base that we used. And to create a connection with the computer and the MIDI software, we used Loop MIDI software. And then as a tool to help us see the MIDI signals, we used Hairless MIDI to serial bridge.
So as we were going through this Project Hub project, we saw the code that this person used, which is attributed to Michael Balzer. And if we go through our GitHub, we essentially used what we needed, commented out what we didn't need, which is essentially a library that gives basic MIDI controller code for reading all of the digital and analog inputs for the Arduino pins. It essentially just maps the exact pins that we used for the Arduino Uno that we're using. We also wanted to add an LCD screen, so we added some custom code here where we basically added a custom character that dances on startup. So as you can see, that's a custom character that we made using binary that just dances in front for our startup sequence, and then it just goes through the entire startup sequence. And then once it's done, we're allowed to use the MIDI controller.
All right, so in order for our MIDI controller to work, we have to be running Loop MIDI. That's our virtual MIDI cable. So that's what this looks like right here. There's no inputs or anything we have to do. We just have to have this software running, and that makes the MIDI ports available from the computer to our MIDI controller. So now that the ports are available, using Hairless MIDI, we create a serial bridge for the MIDI signals. So the serial port is the Arduino that we're using, and so the controller that we're using is the Arduino Uno here, and when we press a button, it sends it into the computer and labels it as Loop MIDI port Arduino. So here in Ableton, it's looking for Loop MIDI port Arduino, which we have here in the MIDI ports. And we allowed the MIDI to be tracked and to be used as a remote. So now that we have the MIDI signals all set up in Ableton, we press a button and it triggers a clap or whatever we want. So these samples here, you can choose any one you want. And as long as you put it where the MIDI signal is mapped to the controller, you can use a button to control that MIDI signal. Using our Hairless MIDI, we can see that there's signal being put into the computer as we press buttons, and we can tell that Ableton is responsive to the MIDI controller. So the first thing we want to do is map the master volume, and Ableton makes MIDI mapping super easy in their software. You can toggle the MIDI mapping mode here in the top right, And once you turn it on, everything that's blue has the potential to be mapped to any hardware components on the MIDI controller. So here, I want to map the master volume to this slider. Now that I've clicked the master volume and I've moved the slider, I can get out of MIDI mode. And now you can see here the slider move. All right, so we just mapped the master control volume to this slider here. So now we're thinking we want to make use of the next slider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to map it to this auto filter. As you can see, as I move the slider, you can see the graph here change. But if you don't want to use a slider for this modulation, you can use a toggle switch. So you'd go into MIDI map mode and we'd click on the frequency and then we'd move the toggle switch. So now, with very slight changes, we have X control using the toggle switch going left to right. And by modulating the resonance, we have Y control on the graph.
So we can click this button here,
Yep.
and it adds, we can manipulate the frequency as well.
Okay, what would you say the functionality of this project is intended to be?
We're building a MIDI controller that can be used with any software that allows MIDI technology. And we have knobs, buttons, sliders, an LCD display, and an awesome toggle MIDI.
Awesome. More hardware to connect to your software.
That's right. All the different hardware types that we can get our hands on to control MIDI data. So it's awesome to have a clear case where you can see the Arduino and all the different hardware pieces that you can use to control the data at your fingertips.
Awesome. Puts you in control.
Yep, and the LCD display is awesome just because it's fun to work with. It's nice to see data and how it correlates with the hardware, especially how you can control that data that the LCD displays with different codes and different ways to manipulate what the LCD screen is used for.
Yeah, we can use it to give our product tons of flavor. So what would the lessons you learned by doing this project be?
I learned that it's a lot of hard work to work with hardware, and it's really fun and rewarding to build a solution. And there's also a lot of parts, like collaborating with different programmers can create a lot of different solutions. And when you tie that with all of the possible hardware components that you can manipulate and use to create a hands-on solution is really cool.
What makes our MIDI controller important?
I think what makes our MIDI controller important is that it can be used with basically any software that uses MIDI inputs, and yeah, it's just a really cool little handheld device that I think can be universal for a lot of different things.
Exactly. I read an article about a Disney engineer using MIDI to control flames at a show. So it's basically as universal as a keyboard.
Absolutely.
And what did you learn by building it?
So I'm a software engineer right now, so learning the other side of the coin of hardware was something I've never done before, so it was really cool seeing the two mesh together and work in harmony to make this really cool project.
I've done so much software going through school. It was really interesting to see the way that connects with the hardware. Functions that I had written, for projects in the past, seeing how those functions then are compiled and then communicate with the hardware, it really gave me a whole new perspective on my major and on the field I'm going into. The reason I think our project's important is because I think it enables people to express their creativity. I saw in just, a semester, us come together, build this thing, and then in an afternoon after it was completed, be able to put, a couple of tunes together. It wasn't anything professional or something we'd release, but it was cool because we had made it, and yeah.
I learned how many little bitty pieces it takes to make something seemingly simple. Like a CPU, you just see a square. You don't see the thousands and thousands of A transistors, but also B layers that stack on top of each other to make the CPU. And in a broader sense, we see that with our project because even a microcontroller that's seemingly simple has a bunch of tiny little parts, and each one of us in the group also had our own role in making this. So stuff that seems really simple, honestly, is really complex on the inside, and I'm glad we stuck to something simple because of that.
Why do you think our MIDI controller is important?
Our MIDI controller is important because it empowers people to more accurately connect their thoughts to the technology. I saw this video by a tech reviewer, and he's saying that the way software and hardware is headed, we have less and less delay between our thoughts and what we're actually able to put into the real world. So without MIDI, you're typing on keyboards, dragging a mouse, trying to get either notes for music or any other macros you're trying to do. And that's just not good because your thoughts are always traveling faster than your body. Whereas with MIDI, it lessens that delay exponentially. There's far less time in between you thinking of something and you actually doing it, regardless of what that thing is.